Right on. So as promised, Unbreaking Science is back, and we have quite a lineup of guests coming to you. It's been a while. The move is over. We have relocated. We're now in the Michigan area, and I'm not going to mess around because today's guest is Dr. Kory. I've got nothing to say. I want to hear it from him. Dr. Kory, how you been, my friend?
Hey, Jack. Nice to see you.
Right on. So we spoke about a year ago, and of course we went over most of the science that was available at the time, and not a lot of people have had a time to keep up with what's happening with early ambulatory treatment, as well as ivermectin in particular. We've seen meta-analysis published. We saw Dr. Tess Lowry work on a meta-analysis, and then there's something about a study that wasn't quite right, and then there's another meta-analysis that was published. And so I want to just talk with you about the sociology of medicine and science around early treatment and these peer-reviewed publications, as well as regulatory science. I mean, let's start with the update. So what's happened in your view over the past year that people that caught you on Unbreaking Science last year, right? Like everything that's happened.
So Jack, you got to remind me, we talked before ivermectin, before our group came on to ivermectin, or after?
No, it was after. Yeah.
It was after, yeah. So, our review paper, we still stand by its conclusions. All the data that we amassed for it point to just absolute, just inarguable, criteria to support the deployment of ivermectin in the treatment and prevention. You want me to try to recap the last year, Jack?
No, the important things that happened. So last time that we talked...
Let me try. So, what's happened is the data continued to deepen from many different sources. So, one thing that you said in your introduction is, you talked about these randomized controlled trials and the controversy and fraud around them. And I got to tell you, I am beyond the randomized controlled trials. I don't even talk about them anymore. You know why? It's because, number one, there are 32 randomized controlled trials, 16 of them double-blind. Even if you take 1, 2, or 3 out as fraudulent or irregularities, and I got to tell you, the other side has amassed some... Have you seen this group that's doing this? It's like these never-been-published nobodies that no one's ever heard of, and they're just trying to find fault with the evidence base, which is, I got to tell you, is a tell. It's exactly what corporate interests do when science is inconvenient to their goals. It's called disinformation. What they do is they try to distort and inject doubt into the science that goes against their objectives. And so anything you see about attacking the randomized controlled trials, it's disinformation, period. And so I find it absurd. I laugh at it. But the real reason why I ignore the randomized controlled trials is that when you look at what we call the totality of the evidence, which is the randomized trials, the observational trials, the basic science, the 10 years of bench research of ivermectin working against numerous RNA viruses, then you look at the case series, case reports, then you look at the epidemiologic, the health ministry test and treat program. It's like you're drowning in positive data. You can't find negative data. Oh, actually, that's not true. You can find a few trials which didn't find a benefit or a slight worse outcome in a tiny series of events. But it's just overwhelming, and so I try not even to get into the trials because that's what they want us to do, which is, remove all evidence except for randomized trials. And I got to point out, Jack, you know this, that, unbreaking science, right? One of the ways in which science is broken is they've led almost the entire medical community into this automaton robotic belief. Randomized controlled trials, randomized controlled trials. The truth is only found in randomized controlled trials.
That's
and,
right.
and, the problem with that is that if you lead the entire medical community believing that, then the only things that can be proven are through randomized controlled trials. And then they even step the bar even higher. They say, not only must be a randomized controlled trial, but it has to be a massive, prospective, double-blind, multi-center randomized controlled trial. And then you're raising the bar even higher. Who Who can afford those? Who can afford those? Well, it's two people or two entities. One is pharmaceutical companies, and then the other one would be the NIH giving grants. Now, we'll get into regulatory capture at some point, but does the NIH fund research into compounds that would make pharmaceutical companies unhappy?
Yeah.
Well, they actually are funding ivermectin right now, but they can also fund trials that don't really produce the outcome that we want and that they might want. So it's the whole thing is crazy with these randomized controlled trials. And I just want to finish by saying there's one simple reality of evidence-based medicine which is not taught, not emphasized, and is immensely important for all doctors and all citizens to know, which is if you look over these meta-analysis, one actually published in the Cochrane Library, they compared randomized controlled trials versus observational controlled trials throughout the history, throughout the decades. And you know what they find? Nearly identical outcomes in both. But yet, the powers that be say, no, we don't listen to observational controlled trials. You'll make mistakes. There's confounders. They're not equally matched. And they'll come up with everything because they got to have you believe that only those big, bad randomized controlled trials will find truth. And so I'm not playing that here. It's nonsense. And,
well, you're right on target with what they changed the rules. You're supposed to be able to use real-world evidence.
Yes.
Right? You're supposed to be able to use real-world evidence. E.O. Wilson's an evolutionary biologist and an ecologist, and he has this great book called Consilience. If the consilience of the evidence or all of the evidence is consistent, it's internally consistent, it doesn't really conflict with each other. You can have observational studies, you can have the territory analysis, right? And tell me, didn't you see some geographic areas that weren't using ivermectin, and then they started, and then they stopped? So you basically have like the evidence for causality is a reversal experiment. So on this entire population, what happened? What tell us about the territory analysis?
Yes, so just coming out of those trials, because ultimately, trials have selected populations, they have certain conditions, they actually have massive faults in a fast-moving disease because they can't capture patients early on. So they're always going to be a day late, dollar short, and they're oftentimes underdosed. And for less than you'd like duration. But when you actually look at the epidemiologic studies, right? So let me just rattle them off. So number one, the first and most impressive study, or the first impressive study, was in Peru. That was a paper by Juan Chimie, David Scheim, and Jennifer Hibbard. And they looked at this military operation, governmental operation in Peru last year, in 2020, where in like 25 regions of Peru, the states would do ivermectin distribution campaigns to all the highest risk and the households, and the Navy was involved in distributing, and they had mass distribution in every area. They started at different times. But when you looked at the case counts and deaths in every area, basically it was so crazy, like repeatedly in every region, within 11 days of the start and the distribution throughout that region, boom, you saw this precipitous drop in cases and death count. And it wasn't all at the same time. You can't say it was seasonal, because some were in June, some were in July, some were in August, and you saw that same reproducible. It was like gobsmacking. So that was one paper. The other really important ones are the two states. So Mexico City last winter, they only put up their paper maybe a few months ago, but they were getting killed. They were in a humanitarian crisis, oxygen running out, hospitals filling, and they had one state health sort of ministry, which was actually fighting with the federal health ministry. It's kind of a weird system they have. It's almost like, this is a bad analogy, almost like if the NIH did one thing and the CDC wanted them to do another, right? So it's like a breakaway institution, which is so cool. And they put out 250 mobile units in Mexico City, massive testing in the hardest hit areas, ivermectin to everyone, early treatment, 3 days, only 12 milligrams a dose, which I got to tell you, would be the minimum of what ivermectin can achieve, 12 milligrams for 3 days. And they saw, and they did a massive analysis, right? Over 100,000 patients they looked at. 50,000 got treated, over 70,000 didn't, and they saw like a 76% reduction in hospitalizations. They like emptied hospitals within 6 to 8 weeks. I mean, it was a fantastic what they put in. So that's a second one. And then you have this 2 states in Argentina, La Pampas and Misiones, same thing. Early test and treat, 0.6 mg per kg, which is actually what people would freak out about because it's 3 times the normal dose. They did it for 5 days. Probably the highest and most aggressive dosing regimen. And in Misiones, they had 88% reduction. 88%.
So these impressive numbers. By the way, Pierre, people are telling me on the feedback that there seems to be something wrong with your microphone. If you have a mic plugged in, can we just use what's on your laptop? There's a bit of a buzz.
Yeah, I hear a sound. I think it's coming through. Let me turn down the volume. Is that better?
No, it sounds like you're, it sounds pretty cool. It sounds like you're on one of those robot shows, from the 1960s. So.
Oh, it is? I can switch. Give me 1 second.
Sure. So while you're working on that, I'm going to set the context here for what's going on. So when the randomized studies and the observational studies came out, these came out in the context of an emergency use authorization did not exist for any standard of care whatsoever. The remdesivir wasn't even on the table. The patients were being sent home to sicken in place. They, in my view, as an evolutionary biologist, if you want to know where variants come from, they come from patients that are sent home with a positive test result, and they're told to get as sick as you can, which means get as highly viremic as you can, and as much virus in your body as you can, and then come to us if you need emergency care. So that's where variants are coming from, and and so patients were also dying. You've got this huge death rate, but no advice on treatment. No drink chicken soup, no vitamin D3, nothing like that. So the culpability here is massive. And of course, everyone knows that it was a race to the vaccine, so we couldn't have anything distract from that. In fact, Fauci said we wouldn't want too many people to get natural immunity because it might interfere with the need for a vaccine program. That's a direct quote, paraphrased. So when the consilience of the evidence from the randomized clinical trials, the observational studies, these geographic or territorial real-world data, the public health data from real-world, the reversibility of the effect of ivermectin on entire populations where they weren't giving it, and then they did, and then everything plummeted, and then politically they had to stop, and then it comes back. Dr. Kory has been on this whole time, but that's not where I don't want you to recap all the realities here. All these, again, you've done enough of that. That's everywhere. What I want to talk about is in the history of your life experience in medicine, and in my life experience, I want to compare notes on the sociology of this kind of dampening of science, this silencing. I want to talk about the censorship. I watched you on Brett Weinstein. I've seen you on Dr. Bean. I'm a fan of both of those guys, and they did a great. And they're very, very careful. The fact that this objective science and studies that are out there, and the meta-analysis. If one meta-analysis had to be retracted, I understand, because one of the studies was flawed, but there's some question about why it was flawed. Remember, this happened in the context where they were faking studies on a hydroxychloroquine. They were given fatal doses, right? Remember all of those studies? Remember, people, don't forget that there were fake studies that influenced public health. And now in the Journal of Science, Public Health Policy and the Law, there's evidence that they're withholding evidence of adverse events reactions to the vaccine on serious adverse events at a greater rate than mild adverse events. We don't have to talk about that. That's published. That's peer-reviewed. My point is, Dr. Kory, have you ever seen anything like this before in the history of your medical practice where there's viable medical care? It could save people's lives, and the medical industry says, no, we're not going to use it. I can't hear you. There's no mic. Sorry about that.
Can you hear me now? Do you still have that sound?
Totally clear. That's perfectly clear.
Okay. No, of course I haven't seen anything like this, and I've said repeatedly of late, like, I will never be the same again. I went into this thinking, I always heard, there's corruption at the medical journal level, there's regulatory capture and there's influences and come on, I went to college, I read all the books, I've read novels, I used to read, tons of the big novels. And so I always knew that there was this aura or sense of these illicit powers controlling things. Yeah. But I mean, I never understood the extent and the lengths to which those forces would impact policy and the way that they could, and to the I keep saying every day, the levels of absurdity go ever higher and higher, and I don't know when it'll stop. And they double down. The data is going against them on so many policies, and yet they double down, and it's absolutely frightening. It's frightening. But to go back to your point, let's just talk about censorship for a second, because let's do the timeline of the censorship for me. So number one, in an unprecedented action, me and the group, our review paper, it was a narrative comprehensive review, got published, accepted for publication in Frontiers in Pharmacology, pretty high impact profile journal. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't getting published. And we were freaking out because people were dying around the world. And there was this silence, and it was an online publication, and a week would pass, another week would pass, and I would go to my editor, the issue editor, whose name actually was Robert Malone. That's how I first met Robert. Because he's the one who had proposed this special issue on repurposed drugs. Yeah. And nothing was happening. And guess what? We finally find out, because I started to push, and I started to really push this journal. I was writing increasingly, I wouldn't say threatening, but volatile emails, because I suspected malfeasance. And I said, listen, if you don't publish this paper and or something, I have to suspect malfeasance, and I'm going to go public with this. And then we heard from the editor of all of the Frontiers journals, right? Because there's about 20 of them. And suddenly we were told that they called in some independent, anonymous peer reviewer who disagreed with our conclusions and made a recommendation to retract the paper. Now, that paper was peer-reviewed by 4 peer reviewers. 3 of them were senior governmental scientists, 2 at the FDA, 1 at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. Okay. And it was a rigorous peer review. And suddenly this anonymous reviewer, I got to tell you, me and the whole team, my co-authors, I mean, cumulative 150 years, in academia with everyone, never had they had a paper retracted after peer review, ever. And it's almost 2,000 peer-reviewed publications. And so that's when we knew that something might not be right. And then let's go down the list. 6 to 8 weeks later, Tess Lawrie, her systematic review and meta-analysis goes to Lancet Respiratory. Lancet Respiratory passes peer review. And then she gets a letter from the editor saying that I'm sorry, but we can't publish this paper. And they made some comment that they just don't think the evidence is rigorous enough. And I mean, her paper was just objective. I mean, she did what she's done. Her and her group are world famous, top-notch guideline developers and systematic reviewers. And hers got rejected. Hector Carvalho's paper, JAMA, sat on it for 2 months, wouldn't publish, and finally sent it back to them. Never went out to peer review, and they just said, sorry, we can't publish this. And then it goes on. So Flavio Cottajani, he's the one who did these incredible, really well done, double-blind, randomized controlled trials in Brazil on anti-androgen therapy. So proxalutamide, New England Journal of Medicine, went through peer review, accepted for publication, and what happened, Jack? Didn't get published. You know what they did? They came up with it. They sent it back, and they said, you know what? We've decided that in order to publish this, we would need to look and examine the patient-level data, and we don't have the resources for that, so we're sending it back. And that's
unprecedented.
That was 2 months of sitting on it. New England Journal of Medicine. So it goes on and on. So you have Frontiers, you have Lancet, you have New England Journal of Medicine, you have JAMA. I mean, all of the big guys. And then the hit pieces, okay? Let's talk about Cochrane Library. They literally publish a systematic review meta-analysis of 14 trials when there was 24 in the other meta-analyses at the same time. They divided them up in tiny piles. They found each one inconclusive, and they violated like every aspect of what you would do, not only normally, but even in a pandemic. And so it's it's so tiresome for me to sit there and say, corruption, but there's only one way you can suppress the efficacy of ivermectin. There's only one way, and it's by distorting, suppressing, and attacking the science. And Jack, that repurposed drugs have decades of history of pharma attacking them. They have like a couple of business principles that they follow, how to maximize money, how to rush, BS drugs to trial, right, by manipulating studies, unique populations, short follow-ups, they know how to make positive studies, right? But they also have, equally as they do that, they know how to go after and take down repurposed drugs. And their efforts here with ivermectin are unprecedented.
It's just been an onslaught. It's just been a total slaughter. You turn your volume down a little. Turn your volume. I'm echoing now.
Slaughter of people.
Yeah, it's been a slaughter of science, a slaughter of people. When I was a second-year assistant professor, Department of Pathology, University of Pittsburgh, School of Medicine, I was also under Ron Herberman at the Cancer Center. And I was invited by Sudhir Srivastava, who is the Early Detection Research Network director at the NCI, to go to New Jersey. And in New Jersey, I met with, there must have been 200 people from different pharmaceutical companies that were there to learn about how to analyze microarray data. Well, Sudhir was supposed to give the plenary, and he couldn't give the plenary. He was sick. He called me up and he said, "Do you want to give a plenary the night before?" So I put up a stadium of 50,000 people. My first words to pharma in a formal setting that I was their invited speaker was, "There's 50,000 people that are going to die from colon cancer this year, and it's your fault." My second slide was 10 stadiums. I said, "That's 500,000 people in 10 years, and you guys, it's your fault." Of course, I know how to stir up the pot, right? So then I said, "The problem is you guys don't know how to make money off of naturally occurring compounds." And I told them the story about uroguanolin. It's an enteric peptide that survives digestion, goes down through the gut, prevents colon cancer in APC-min mice. So listen, there's solutions that are out there medically. And this is I told the story in my book, Cures versus Profits, but this is unprecedented because, listen, people are dying at the feet of doctors and they're being pulled away in body bags day after day after day after day. And the FDA has a policy. I learned it from our friend Dr. McAuliffe. You can use whatever you think is going to work if there's not a standard of care. As long as the doctor thinks that for this patient there's an effective possibility, then go ahead, off-label's good, go for it. So when the FDA comes out, I want to be sure Mike's working, but when the FDA comes out and says, ivermectin is not FDA approved for COVID-19 as a reminder, am I incorrect in assuming that they should also inform the public and the medical community and the pharmacists that it's not approved for that? I mean, right? Isn't that where we're at? Yeah, I don't hear you, bud. Sorry. I still don't hear you. We'll wait for you. So the FDA specifically says if the patient can benefit from something and the attending physician thinks that it might benefit, if there's not a standard of care for that condition, that they can use it. I had to use a phone call. I don't know what it is. Your mic die? It was like on the fritz. It was all staticky. You want to try the link on your phone? It'll work on your phone, that link I sent. If you go to the text and call us right back, I'll just go solo here for a minute. All right, well, Dr. Kory figures this out. Right, so imagine if you have patients dying from cancer and there's no known treatment for that cancer. None. Nothing's known for that particular kind of cancer. Aren't you going to try to treat the patient? It's a brand new type of cancer. There's no standard of care. This is a brand new pathogen. There's no standard of care. And when they bring on, remdesivir, they're trying to bring on this molnupiravir with preliminary data that hasn't survived peer review. Merck has announced that they're actually producing molnupiravir at risk, which means that they're putting millions of dollars into the production of these pills. And if you go to my Popular Rationalism Substack, you'll see that I wrote an article about molnupiravir. I want to know why they actually had two studies going, one that they published and one that they didn't publish. They never published a study. It's an interim analysis, the science by press release. So when Merck comes out and say molnupiravir is the next big thing, and the press, goes with it and says, wow, it's Merck. This might be the next big thing. We're going to save a lot of lives. And there's two trials. One was in hospitalized patients and one was in non-hospitalized patients, and they only published the non-hospitalized patients. Yeah. So you got to hang up the computer. If you hang up on the computer, the phone call will go through on the phone. So if you close out that browser, sorry. So molnupiravir, if they had two trials, right? And with the second trial, then they shut down the study for business reasons. You can read about that in my Popular Rationalism Substack. And now we're all expected to see this huge success with molnupiravir coming out of a press release. In contrast to the massive amount of data that comes through peer-reviewed studies, randomized clinical trials, observational trials, regional analysis, real-world data, meta-analysis on ivermectin, the sheer strength of that, type of evidence, okay. And molnupiravir has this baloney hash up. It's a hack, right? So with molnupiravir, this pill from Merck, having far less data, far less evidence. It's unconscionable, absolutely unconscionable, that we would even come close to seeing something like this. And they're accusing the ivermectin data of not being strong. They had 775 patients or something for a very short period of time, and were ready to completely revolutionize and change clinical care over what? A press release? I mean, can this actually be happening? It's just incredibly unacceptable, right? So we try to get Dr. Kory back on here. I want to let you guys know that Epoch Times put out an article covering our grand jury investigation. This grand jury investigation is going to get to the bottom of the question of whether or not CDC manipulated data. We know they did. In the early reports of COVID-19, and overestimating the number of cases of COVID-19. I've been called out by USA Today for having the guts to publish this report by Dr. Henry Ely and colleagues, after thorough, careful peer review in the Journal of Science, Public Health Policy, and the Law, all an IPAC initiative, IPAC PHPI journal. And USA Today said that there's nothing going on with nurses leaving hospitals that has anything to do with vaccines. So I fact-checked them. This Popular Rationalism Substack page, I'll bring this up, something that I think you guys would appreciate, the depth of and perspective of my analysis, I hope that you find informative. Let's see, I hope it comes up. Sure does. All right, so this is it right here. One of the articles is Medical versus Legal Authority in the U.S. Why you're libertarian, you don't know it. But I certainly don't mean this to be a political website. And the difference between medical, legal, and moral authority, if you can imagine that there actually are differences.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, there you are. All right, we got him back.
All right. How's the sound?
Perfect. Sounds good.
All right.
If it dies again, it's your mic. We're going to have to get you a new mic. So make sure you go to flccc.net and donate and support the frontline doctors so Dr. Kory can get a new microphone.
All right. Sounds good. Where were we, Jack?
We were talking about the consilience of evidence and how, well, I was just talking about how molnupiravir is like a blip, a data blip. It's not even a study. It's a press release, and they're about to change all of clinical care officially over a press release. Come on.
And, what's more disturbing, right? I don't know if you went into the whole mutagenic, the history of it, which is that a pharmaceutical company abandoned that drug in 2003 because it's a mutagen. It works by causing mutations in the virus, and it's known to insert into mammalian cells, and it caused birth defects and missing skulls in animals. And so they were like, you don't bring a mutagen into market. They abandoned it in 2003, and now it's back. Now, here's the other disturbing thing, right? So just as I was talking about the decades of research looking at observation controlled trials and randomized controlled trials, and they have near identical outcomes, there's also been analyses of the decades of pharmaceutical conducted trials and then those funded by government in academic medical centers. Okay? What do they find? Well, pharmaceutical companies are generally positive 86% of the time, while academic center trials are positive 50% of the time. So you have this huge discrepancy. The other thing is, everything that they do, it's out there. So number one, they change endpoints in the middle of trials when it's not going their way, right? And they're allowed to do it. Remdesivir in front of the entire scientific community of the world changed their primary endpoint. And Fauci calls it a game change. They're literally doing a pharma tactic in front of everybody. And guess what? It becomes the standard of care in the United States at $3,000 a dose, and it remains so, despite numerous randomized controlled trials coming out since showing it doesn't work, right? Yet they keep going with it at $3,000 a dose. They just can't stop the trough, right? So when you look at molnupiravir and you see this long history, so they change primary endpoints. It's been well described. They bury adverse data. Suddenly, patients who don't do so well in the trial, where are they in the spreadsheet? They were there and now they're not, right? And so when they come out with a press release saying 50% reduction in hospitalization, I'm sorry, but given what we're seeing in the pandemic, given the absurdities of the policies being driven by what is clearly financial interest, and you look at molnupiravir, right, which in one article I read, if the $700 a course, a treatment course stands up, they stand to make $700 billion in the next 2 to 3 years.
That's crazy.
Do you think they could bury a few patients from those spreadsheets in the interest of $700 billion?
That's crazy.
And so I just don't trust them. I don't trust the safety, and I don't trust the efficacy. And then beyond that is that if you look, like I said, the Missionis data of early treatment, 88% reduction in death. And yet we're going to make standard of care molnupiravir. Absurd.
That's crazy. So that Popular Rationalism Substack article I wrote on, we were referencing the fact that there were two studies. One was in hospitalized patients and one was in non-hospitalized patients. And unbelievably, right there in front of the scientific community, like you said, the medical community, they did the non-hospitalized patients study. That was the 775 patients or whatever for 6 months follow-up, no big deal. Here it is, it's saving lives 50%. But then there's this mysterious 300 patients that show up in this other hospitalized trial that they terminated for business reasons. Not for medical
And-
reasons, not for lack of safety,
Yeah.
for business reasons.
Jack, okay, so what is, we don't even have to discuss what they meant by that. It's called failure of the trial. It probably was so bad that even they couldn't whitewash or put lipstick on it, right? So number one, they have a hospital trial which fails, which I gotta say would make sense to me. It's an antiviral, right? Just like remdesivir, why would you give an antiviral started in the hospital? So, like, I'm not killing them for not pursuing it. I think it's stupid they even tried it. I mean, why would you even do a hospital trial? Okay, so they stop it for business reasons. But let's talk about, don't we have this clinical trials registry called, what's it called again? Oh, yeah, clinicaltrials.gov, right? And one of the purposes is so that you don't have publication bias. And so when you register a trial, you're committing to sharing that data at the end of the trial, positive or negative, because there was a huge trend in clinical research where there was this preponderance of positive trials. And so now, I thought it was an agreement with the journals that you don't publish any more trials unless they were pre-registered. Right, so you know what their treatment plan, what the data they collect. Okay, so, and you should be committed to publishing a negative trial. So, Jack, is that so? What you're saying is the hospital trial is not going to be published?
The hospital trial is registered at clinicaltrials.gov, but it was not published, and I haven't seen any data.
No.
So to put on top of that they did a press release. The Securities Exchange Commission should nail them for putting forward-looking statements, right, but not referencing the second trial. That's huge.
So it's called pre-promotional advertising, which is illegal. So they're attacking a competitor before they can bring theirs to market. And what's interesting is I know folks in government who saw that. They saw that in February, and guess what? And these are actually people, Congress people and their staff on committees which control the budget of these agencies. And they went to the FDA and said, this is illegal and you need to do something about it. Guess what happened? The FDA looked at those statements and said they could find no fault. I mean, is that unsurprising? It gives you the level of corruption this is.
This is why we can't trust the three-letter agencies to do the job that they do. This is why I proposed Plan B to actually have a public health system that was concerned about what was killing American citizens and causing them to be ill by research, by objective bona fide research. So from a scientific perspective, we went over the biases, and we've seen it. It's right there in front of everyone. If people don't know this, there's a grand jury investigation that is now underway. It's been filed by 2 senators from Oregon as a result of effort that was published in my journal, Science, Public Health Policy, and the Law, based on misleading information and biasing of data by the CDC. So, I know they're going to come after me. USA Today already came after me. They're going to come after Dr. Ely, right? Good news is I don't have any skeletons in my closet at all, right? So, Pierre and I didn't go to college, so we don't have any war stories to share. But I wish I did, go to college with you, like an old friend at this point. But when we're looking at regulatory capture and regulatory science, they have to abide by their own policies, and yet they seem to just run roughshod over all of their own policies, guidances, regulations. So at some point in time, Congress has to step in and do more than slap them on the hand. We have to see some head rolling. We have to see some people resign. We have to see a shakedown from the top down and a restructuring, a major restructuring of oversight. I don't want big business. I don't want more oversight committee. We basically have to say, listen, CDC, here's what you get. You get a little placard in the hallway, right, where you can say, hey, if you want your vaccine, there's still vaccines are still around, or we're doing research over here, fine. But they don't have the authority anymore. And one of my recent articles distinguishes between legal, medical, and moral authority, and they have lost their moral authority. So it's up to every person in the United States to get a hold of your congressman and senator and say, we need absolute reform. I'm talking about historic scale reform of how HHS is run. You agree?
I totally agree. I mean, not only it should be done, but Jack, what has happened and where they've led us to, and what this calamity, which is ongoing, this slow-moving car crash, the American people are going to be left with complete loss of trust in those institutions. I actually think they're going to die. In the state and structure and funding and the way it's appointed and in their mandates, they're going to die. I mean, you cannot continue to survive and hold, like you said, that moral authority. And I got to tell you, though, it hasn't happened yet. There's good portions of the country, if you give off an opinion which is contrary to them, they'll say, but the FDA, and all the newspapers say this. Anytime they want to put anyone down, they don't cite science. They cite the agencies. And so you can see there's still a lot of power in saying the FDA says this. And, the other form of suppression, right? We talked about medical journals, right? So, after my testimony, I won't say I became a public figure, but certainly, our organization became very popular, and a lot of people came to us for advice, and I started talking. And I was invited for podcasts and interviews and radio shows, and I love it because I'm part of an organization. Our primary purpose is literally to develop protocols and disseminate that knowledge. So I'll take any opportunity to do that. And everything, and this is where science became politicized, or really it's just the structure of media, but everything came from sort of right-leaning outlets. Yeah. And or maybe center, but nothing television, nothing major newspaper. And the few times where you'd get an interview from a major newspaper, it was a he said, she said article. And so they would quote me on a few of my opinions. They wouldn't really ever give me the data citations. And then they would end with the FDA, the NIH, one of the alphabet agencies and what they said. And so any reader's like, oh, so there's a doctor who has this crazy fringe idea, but these guys, they know what they're doing. And so you get no credibility in the major media, and so I got to tell you, it's still massive portions of the country that are still trusting. But if you listed all of the bizarre policies that they've ignited, they couldn't even find the ability to recommend vitamin D. Yeah. Knowing they have data, FDA has data that a major portion of this country is vitamin D deficient. All of the overwhelming data to show that if you're not vitamin D deficient, you're going to fare better. You're going to have much lower risk of dying. They don't even recommend vitamin D. And Fauci is known on record that he takes vitamin D. Yeah. He takes vitamin C and vitamin D every day.
So I don't know about you, but I've got a bandwidth problem with time and effort, right? So we're just swamped, killed, right? So here's the thing, people. I don't have time to FOIA Peter Marks at the FDA. I don't to get his conflict of interest statement or Fauci's conflict of interest statement. I just don't have time to track down exactly why these people are acting the way that they're acting. But this has to be reversed, right? So about when it comes to solutions, I'm not going to put it on you, Pierre, but the solution is that we basically have to make all the connections somehow. The grand jury investigation, there's some cases going forward that's going to have the power of discovery, and it's really super important, people, that you get involved and make sure that you keep asking questions. Chase them, and chase them. Don't take their pat answer. And you know what the FDA is doing now, and the CDC? They're writing back to people like Steve Kirsch, saying, "Well, we basically think there's no merit to your question, and we stand by our position." No explanation. He puts a demand on them for data. So, Pierre, how is this going to end? When people, what's your take really on how severe the coronavirus pandemic is now in the United States? Are we still at,
You're still seeing the listen. A year ago, when you look at the summer, you interpose the graphs, right? The graphs that are accessible to all. And you look at 2020 summer and 2021 summer, and in between over 300 million vaccinations, and that was the only strategy they allowed, right? No vitamin D, no ivermectin, no hydroxychloroquine, none of the other. And by the way, there's like 3 dozen molecules, compounds that are effective in COVID-19. Some of them over the counter, right? If you look at our protocols, right, povidone iodine, goggles and mouthwashes and nasal drops will absolutely decrease the vital burden. Huge impacts on outcome. Nizoxanide. I mean, I can go down the list of stuff that works. And not one recommendation around anything. Vaccines. It's a vaccine predominant strategy. And look where it's gotten us. You had 3 times the cases this summer as last. And so how can you, and then what are they doing? They're doubling down. They want to jab more. And so, and then again, I don't want to share an opinion on vaccine, whether you should or shouldn't. My problem is with the vaccine policy, which is there's no data being shared. And the media's not asking for that source data. They're literally just simply printing what officials say, not what the data says, what the officials say. Number 2, the fact that they are willy-nilly and refuse to look at the mountains of data showing that natural immunity is far stronger than the vaccines. And yet they want to vaccinate people naturally immune. And so you have to ask yourself, just with all of the aberrant behavior around everything else, what's driving that policy? And so I don't know where this goes.
Right. So you don't have to know. That's the whole thing. So early on, you'll recall I wrote about pathogenic priming, and there's antibody-dependent enhancement and everything else. And when we see case numbers increase following vaccination, they can't rule out that the vaccine is making people more susceptible. So what do we call that medically? We have to call it something. We have to call it vaccine failure at the very least, because it's not protective against new variants, right? So if you think about
it, created a variant that's more transmissible. There is some evidence for that, right? I mean, Delta's pretty bad. I mean, it's highly transmissible, huge virals.
The leaky vaccine will cause. It's well known from animal studies and chickens even. The leaky vaccines will cause the emergence of more virulent strains. So. But nevertheless, if we call it vaccine failure, that means that it's not protective. But what if you have negative vaccine efficacy? So the data from Barnstable County, I ran the numbers to calculate vaccine efficacy. It's negative vaccine efficacy if you got both jabs. It's negative. So the data from Israel, absolutely, right? And then if you do a whole country analysis, the countries that are taking up the most vaccinated countries have a larger number of new cases. Pick any week at this point in time. So what is actually happening is self-defeating. The vaccine program becomes self-defeating, and when we see this happen, and they're not able to make a change, because I don't think they believe their own baloney. I don't think they drank the Kool-Aid to the point where they believe their own lies. So they're just right. So this to me is they've admitted it. So this to me is the most egregious abuse of administrative rulemaking. And it seems to me they've kind of gone crazy that they think that what they say is the law the minute they say it, like there's some kind of royalty or king or something. And so this is why, again, people, you have to get on the backs of your congressmen and your senators, and you have to get in there and you have to say, we need a shakedown from the top down. And we need to really revisit why we even have this HHS, why do we have the FDA, why do we have the CDC, and while you're at it, throw in the EPA, right? Lately, the EPA did something good. They banned chlorpyrifos, which is really strongly associated with autism in upstate New York, in the counties. They did a county-level analysis, so that's good. But we really need to take a good close look at whether the administrative rule-making changes that came with the regulatory government are inevitably going to lead to these abuses, and I think that they are. It's more the regulatory capture. It's over-reliance on regulatory rulemaking instead of representative government. And so you people, you are the solution. Your voice matters to your congressmen and your senators, and don't believe for 1 minute that it doesn't. When you pick up that phone and you put your phone call and you say, I want Fauci out, or if you say, I want Peter Marks investigated for conflicts of interest because his behavior is inexplicable under any rational analysis of what a human being would do in that position, then if enough people do it, then they'll listen. So we really need everybody to get on the phone. We need to get your emails out and send it a letter if you need to. However, you go down to the local office and meet with them and demand answers. And ask them, what are you going to do about this? Regulatory science is broken in the United States. It's up to you to do something about it. Put it on your representatives, because that's what they're there for. They have oversight over Fauci. Everybody says, how can Fauci be stopped? Who has oversight? All they have to do is refuse to fund, and the sweetheart deals that go with this $1 trillion coin that they've minted or going to mint or whatever, those sweetheart deals, if enough people stand up and say, this is my number one thing, I want regulatory science to be reined in, regulatory bodies to be reined in, and they need to be held their feet to the fire so they do the appropriate job that they're supposed to do. And if you don't back me in this, I'm not going to vote for you. And they hear that from thousands of people. Clearly, we have the numbers. Like the pilot said, we have all the control. We just don't know it. All right, so Pierre, Kory, last words for you, man.
No, I like your last and I think that's really important. My last words, the only ones I come up with, this is a really highly treated disease. And that's the message we have to get out, and we have to keep pushing it despite this massive censorship from all areas of society, from many mediums, from the journals, media, through the agencies, through the boards. I'm getting. I got my second letter from the medical board now asking me to defend my actions and my states, and who knows? I might even lose my livelihood. And it's just. I don't give up. I've lost 2 jobs already.
That's okay. Well, we're going to make you the CEO of the Frontline Doctors medical facilities that are going to branch out throughout the country. There's hundreds and hundreds of physicians, ethical medical professionals that are quitting their jobs around the country. You might think it's a drop in the bucket, but it's not.
I come up with a name for those institutions if we build them and staff them, but sound medical.
Yeah, that would be great. So Pierre, one last reminder to you, man. You got to get that mic fixed. It's echoing again. But we all stayed with you because we love you. We've got your back. We're with you. But here's the deal. Go to FLCC. There it is on the screen. FLCCC.net for the science, the meta-analyses, and donate. Get some money to him so he can get a new computer. All right. Thanks so much for being here.
All right. Nice talking.
Right on.
Okay, bye now.
So that's Dr. Pierre Kory, a superhero, absolutely superhero, one of the world's leading experts in ambulatory treatment of COVID-19. Regardless of what the fact checkers say, regardless of what the misinformationists say, and he's the real deal. He's absolutely the real deal, and it's sad to see him, frustrated and kind of down about that at the end there. But the reality is, 100% of the answer comes from you. It's you cannot sit and just be a keyboard warrior. It's impossible to expect change unless you get in the face of your over this administrative rulemaking and the way that studies are conducted, the way that regulatory science and policies are brought forward. I've made a major shift in my own approach to things where I'm starting to do a lot more policy analysis. All right, a lot more commentary on exactly what kind of policies are in place, whether those policies make any sense or not. And to see the grand jury story in the Epoch Times, I'm really empowered. I feel empowered to see that the efforts of the authors that published in my journal, the peer reviewers, everybody that was involved to make sure that the real numbers can be had. The chicanery of not following the rules. Now, people have said and criticized and said, well, of course they've overestimated that. Like, that's new. But the reality is they've never been held accountable for it. And if you think that, oh, this is nothing new, we've known this forever, you know about it because of the work of Dr. Ely and peer reviewers and the decision to publish that paper. You know about it because of that effort, and that effort has now led to grand jury inquiry, and that grand jury will hold people and the entity itself, CDC, accountable to answer to a grand jury to say, this is why we did this, or no, we didn't, or this is why we didn't do this. Specifically, they should have sought oversight from 3 different committees, and they failed to. So, in closing, I just want to reference people to this Popular Rationalism Substack account. Again, for this particular article, if you've missed it, you've been under a rock, because this one just went viral last week. Who are the world's leading authorities in COVID-19 treatment? And I just want to end this with on a positive note. As Dr. Kory said, this is a treatable condition. COVID-19, I asked him in another setting what percentage of the deaths were preventable. Okay, and he said 85% of the deaths that have occurred have been preventable. And so it's totally unconscionable that anyone would act against early treatment. If you're a fact checker and your job is to fact check this particular video, we talked about vaccines. We don't hide our words. We talked about early treatment. We talked about hydroxychloroquine. We talked about ivermectin. I'm a research scientist who oversees peer-reviewed research in a major, emerging, I shouldn't say major, but hopefully major, emerging science and public health policy journal. So you cannot fact check new things that have come out that have just come through peer review. And if you don't have the technical background to understand what it is that we publish, then please don't censor us. I'm asking you to please understand what's happening here, right? We have direct-to-consumer marketing in the United States, and it's the largest source of funding for television and newspapers, print media, electronic media. It's a huge source of funding. So they can't criticize. They can't allow those criticisms to be seen in print. They can't criticize pharma products, otherwise they'll lose their advertisers. That's what's happening. So if you are a fact checker, please understand you're not on the right side here if you're going to shut down people for talking about hydroxychloroquine. You're going to shut down people for talking about ivermectin. You're going to shut down people for talking about vaccines. We know what we're talking about, right? The jig is up, so to speak. So anyway, Dr. James Lyons-Weiler, I'm going to close out here with a plea again. Please go to flcc.net and send them a little bit of money for Dr. Kory in support of what they're doing there. That would be fantastic. All right, guys. Listen, take it easy. I'm going to go out with Nokami's Soundbug. Haven't heard this in a while.
Hi everyone, I'm your host, Dr. James Lyons-Weiler, aka Dr. Jack. In this episode, we're going to be reviewing evidence that science is broken. This is not a news story.
Will be told, people will know the price of corporate science really taking its toll. Whistleblowers blow, public health data low. They say the science is settled, but how do they know?
Science.
Ask questions, critically think, you should try it. It's pure, unadulterated science. I'm breaking science.
Breaking science.
You can't deny it. You sure can't buy it. Fact check, use your brain, don't be quiet. It's pure, unadulterated science. I'm breaking science.
Breaking science.
Using the tools of the trade to back up what we say. You can't be silent when it comes to unbreaking science. Let's light the truth up, next level ultraviolet. You've got a hypothesis, do a critical test. Make an observation without being biased. Use logic and reason mixed with evidence. Look at patterns and results with significance. Calculate them numbers, real accurate, or else your findings won't be legit. Don't cherry pick, but be skeptic. Cause broken science, it makes us sick. That science is being funded by the very same people that run it, so they can promote a product, so they can make that money. Try not to laugh, cause this ain't nothing funny. All these science-like activities, no joke, they call them studies. Hand-picking sample groups and no true placebos. Losing public trust the more and more that we know. The truth will be told, the really taking its toll. Whistleblowers blow, public health data low. They say the science is settled, but how do they know?
Science.
Ask questions, critically think, you should try it. It's pure, unadulterated science. Unbreaking science.
Breaking science.
You can't deny it, you sure can't buy it. Fact check, use your brain, don't be quiet. It's pure, unadulterated science. Unbreaking science.